This is the Ted Wallison Podcast. Brought to you by Halenda's, the meat people. Enjoy their award-winning products at selected Metro, Sobeys, Fortino's, and Foodland locations. Halenda's, the way sausage should taste. And Tom's Place. For the finest in men's clothing at unbeatable prices, it's Tom's Place at 190 Baldwin in the heart of Kensington Market. Tom's Place will suit you. And now, here's Ted Wallison.
50 years ago, a young 15-year-old man hitchhiked a ride in a pickup truck on his way home from a fishing trip on the west coast of British Columbia. Tragically, the truck rolled, severely injuring his spinal cord and paralyzing him from the waist down. His determination, heart, and sense of humor empowered him to accomplish and inspire what most of us could have never even imagined. He became the first person with a disability to graduate with a degree in physical education from the University of British Columbia. He went on to win 9 gold medals at the 1982 Pan Am Games and 3 world championships in wheelchair racing. Between 1980 and 1984, he won 6 Paralympic medals, 4 of which were gold. This year marks the 35th anniversary of the completion of Rick Hansen's Man in Motion World Tour, a tour which took nearly 2 years and covered 40,000 kilometers through 34 countries. That accomplishment gave birth to the Rick Hansen Foundation, which to date has raised more than $360 million to benefit those with disabilities. It's an honor to welcome to the podcast, Rick Hansen. It is indeed an honor to welcome to the podcast, Rick Hansen. Nice to see you again, sir. How are you?
You too, Ted. Thanks. It's great to be here, and I'm really looking forward to it.
There's so much I want to talk to you about, but I want to go back 50 years ago. You're 15-year young man. You're 15 years of age, athletic, having a great time, coming from a fishing trip, and you get into this truck as you're hitchhiking. There's an accident, and suddenly your whole world is turned upside down. And I'm wondering, what did the doctor say to you as you lay there in the hospital bed, and what was your first reaction?
Yeah, it's hard to believe it's been this year, 50 years since that moment in time, that really strange twist of fate. And I can tell you that as a 15-year-old, I had no idea what a spinal cord injury was. I thought if you had an injury, a little sprained ankle or, sore knee or broken leg, you put it in a cast or you do your rehab and you're all better again. But a spinal cord doesn't do that. And that was like a complete shock to me. Even when I was laying on the side of the road, even though I had the sense deep inside that it was going to be a really bad situation, it wasn't until I heard the doctor in that hospital in Williams Lake tell me that I had not only broken my back, but I'd damaged my spinal cord and that I'd never walk again. That was devastating, to say the least, because it's really all I knew. My whole life was around physical activity, sports, the outdoors, hiking, the use of my legs. And in many ways, I thought my whole life was shattered along with my spine.
How do you regroup at that age? I mean, it's that old adage, it takes a village, and I guess in your case, it would have taken that kind of support network to give you the kind of hope and belief in your future.
There's no question. At first, there's that sense of denial that sort of pops in, and I kind of then discounted what he said, and I said I'll prove him wrong. And every waking moment, I basically sort of tried and willed my legs to move, my toes to wiggle, and that went on and on, and then eventually I started to realize that this might not be a temporary thing, and maybe the doctor was right. And that's when the real depression started to really settle in, and I started to think about well, what would life look like? And I didn't know. This is pre-information age and word of mouth, and I had no idea. I didn't know anyone with a spinal cord injury or any kind of significant disability, and so I really needed to paint this black canvas of despair and figure out how to point little bright pieces of light or colored texture, at least into the borders of what this life would look like, to give myself hope. And I think if I hadn't heard information from the medical profession, doctors, nurses, rehab therapists, and then been exposed to role models, peer counselors who came into my life, and they had been living with a spinal cord injury, and they weren't depressed, and they weren't limited, and then all of a sudden I started realizing, okay, well, if they can do it, maybe I can. And this is over quite a number of months, just
Hmm.
starting to kind of realize that, yeah, life could continue. But it wasn't really until I was actually sitting, in the gymnasium with my phys ed teacher, and I was just, kind of having a chat with him, and he said to me, he said, Rick, what do you plan to do, now, and are you gonna get involved in Paralympic sport? And I went, Paralympic sport? Well, that's just that's recreation, right? He goes, no, and he said it's really highly competitive, and he I was sort of discounting using my own internal biases, and he eventually, out of frustration, said, here, look this up, look up the definition of athlete. And I looked and read it, and he said, is there any reference in that definition that says you have to use your legs in order to be one? And it was like the
Yeah.
penny dropped. And so I realized, that sport, everything in my heart, which felt like I was almost born an athlete, could be expressed, but just in a different way. Instead of using my legs, I could use my arms, and the chair would be my vehicle, and Paralympic sport would be the medium. And that started to shift a whole different level of possibility in that blank, dark canvas. The colors of a new way to pursue athletics and go on with my life. Fortunately, people like Bob Redford, my coach, were with me, and people like Stan Strong, the peer counselor, who came and recruited me to join the cable cars wheelchair basketball team. Uh, they
Hmm.
they really got me in motion again, and that was super powerful, very powerful period.
Rick Hansen is my guest. You're the first person to graduate from UBC with a degree in physical education. You must have felt great about that.
I do, especially given when I was encouraged by, again, Bob Redford, my coach and phys ed teacher, to apply, because that's what I'd wanted to do before my injury. And I applied. I told them I was in a wheelchair. Sent it to the faculty at UBC, and waited anxiously. And then months later, I got a letter that said, dear Mr. Hansen, thanks for your application. Unfortunately, we can't accept you into phys ed at this point. We've never had anyone in a wheelchair before. We suggest you come in, take first year arts and science, and maybe we'll have a chat and see what happens. And I saw that as a
Hmm.
rejection. I wasn't going to go to university. I was like pissed off, to be quite frank. And Bob got me back in, and had the conversation. And he said, you gotta think about it. Is this a rejection, or is this an opportunity, a challenge to you? Because they haven't had anybody in their program before, and you're not just doing this for yourself. You're going to set a precedent for others, and they don't know you. They don't know if you've got the right stuff. So why don't you take it as an opportunity and go down there, take first year arts and sciences, meet with them a number of times. If they get to know you, I'm sure they'll let you in. And so, yeah, he convinced me to suck it up and go for it.
Yeah.
And eventually, I did convince them that I was the right person, and they accepted me into the precedent moment. And yeah, it was a tremendous experience. And coming out of that, it was like a renaissance of information, knowledge, experiences, friendships. Even in the application of my Paralympic career, the University of British Columbia became a tremendous accelerator, and they even became a tremendous contributor to get me going on the original Man in Motion tour.
Hmm. You had an incredible career as a Paralympian, medaling, I don't know, 8, 9 different times, world champion, wheelchair racing, 3 gold medals in that, and then came along the Man in Motion World Tour. As a result of what you'd accomplished, did you think that this was something that I should be doing. And at the same time, this is 5 years following Terry Fox's run across the Canada, or attempted run across the Canada, unfortunately. How inspirational was he in terms of you taking on this
Well,
challenge?
Terry was a turned out to be a tremendous friend. And when I was in the wheelchair basketball program, the Vancouver Cable Cars, thanks to Stan Strong, who recruited me, he was the team manager. One of the things that Stan exuded, he was this sort of faceless hero in my mind. Like the example, in hundreds of thousands of Canadians who, donate their time to help support teams so that athletes can pursue their goals and dreams. And he was one of them. He mortgaged his house so that we could actually raise money enough ahead of our fundraisers, so we could buy equipment and uniforms and enter into a North American wheelchair basketball league. And he was helping us with, you know, accessible housing and grants to support our programs or get a new wheelchair. And he's just an amazing mentor and navigator. And Stan asked one thing from us, is to pay it forward. Don't just take from this team, contribute. And one of the things he wanted me to do is to recruit and bring new athletes who love sport and out onto the team. And during a dinner one night with some friends, they told me about this young man who lost his leg to cancer, and he used to play basketball for Simon Fraser University. And he gave me his name, and I called him up that night. It was Terry Fox, and Terry came out to our first practice. He was still on chemotherapy, skinny little kid, hopped into the gymnasium, and he struggled to push the chair. It was a heavy chair, and we wheeled circles around him, and at first I thought he was pretty pathetic, and in terms of his physical capabilities. But I watched him through the practice, and he was just so determined, and it just, you could tell the willpower and the basic basketball skills were there. He was just weak, and
Yeah.
it wasn't using his upper body much,
Mhm.
and so he kept at it and kept at it, and he became one of the best players on our team. And we trained together. We had a lot in common. He was in human kinetics at SFU. I was in phys ed at UBC, and we really loved spending time together. Definitely inspired each other. I think coming to the cable cars uh, really gave Terry a sense, that he had nothing to complain about. All these guys who had, many of them, more disabling conditions, were just keep giving it and going for life and being athletes, not disabled. And Stan Strong, of course, inspired that sense of paying it forward for him as well. And so we traveled a lot together, roomed together, and yeah, he inspired the heck out of me. And when I saw his journey unfold as he told me about his dream, and as I watched it, I realized that he was not. I mean, even though his focus was to try to raise money for cancer research, he was actually indirectly, he was changing attitudes about the potential of people with disabilities. And
Sure.
I've been fighting attitudes my whole life, my own attitude and
Yeah.
stigma, attitudes of society. All the athletes that I'd met, they'd all had the same story, no matter where I went, nationally or internationally. And yeah, so eventually I decided to combine my dream of the physical challenge of wheeling around the world with a purpose. And ultimately, yeah, Terry had a huge inspiration and impact on my journey on so many levels. An incredible Canadian, and yeah,
Yeah.
just an amazing guy.
It's. I have a granddaughter who's 3.5 years old, who knows who Terry Fox is because she takes part in the Terry Fox. Well, I guess in their case, it's kind of a mini run or a walk or
Yeah,
whatever, because she's still a little thing. But and I thought to myself, when she was telling me about this, I thought, wow, that is really incredible. And if he only knew the kind of influence and inspiration that he's passed along to generations since his passing, I don't think he would even believe
yeah.
it.
No, and he was such a humble guy, incredibly driven, wanting to make a difference. But yeah, he would just be he'd be kind of chuckling with a little bit of that blush cheek,
Yeah.
and kind of going, "Oh shucks," almost, and yeah, because he was doing it to make a difference. But I don't think he could ever anticipate, especially when he when he was forced to abandon his journey. I really think that that was a crushing blow for him, and I don't think I think he would have wanted his dream to continue, but I don't think he could have really anticipated just how unbelievable it was going to be. Yeah.
Couple things about the Man in Motion World Tour that I want to talk about, because I want to talk about some of the other things that your foundation and the things that you're doing now. But there is a film called St. Elmo's Fire, and the theme song from St. Elmo's Fire is called Man in Motion, or I guess it's the sub theme of the song. There's an interesting story behind how that became your theme, kind of slipped into the film by David Foster, I guess it was.
I can see a new horizon underneath the blazing sky. I'll be where the eagles flying higher and higher. Gonna be a man in motion. All I need is a pair of wheels. Take me where my future's lying. St. Elmo's fire.
Can you share that with me?
Yeah, it was really interesting. Before we left on our tour, as we were trying to gather support, somebody had said, well, we should try to find some musician, songwriter to create a theme song, an anthem for us, and someone even had the audacity to think that maybe it could be a popular song that could go out and inspire millions, and ultimately Terry David Mulligan was with us at a fundraiser before we left, and he came up to us and said, "Do you think you should actually do a theme song?" And we went, "Yeah, that's exactly what we want. Who should we talk to?" And he goes, "You should talk to David Foster." And I said, "Who's that?" and because he's so obscure, really, because it's the stars who do the songs that have the notoriety. And then he told me who he was involved with, and I went, "Oh man, that would be awesome." So he said, "I know him, and I'll send your little promotional video down to him, and maybe he'll be inspired." And so he did, and we didn't think anything of it because the beginning of the tour was looming, and we were heading south from Vancouver all the way down the west coast of the United States. And then as we got closer to Los Angeles, which is where David was living and recording, he contacted our office and said, "Hey, I'm actually working on something, and I'd like to connect with Rick when he's in LA." And so he did, and he brought out the beginnings of his song and had a press conference, and then he invited us over to his studio where he was doing a recording with a band, and the phone rang and he was talking, and then he said, "Hey Rick, you want to say hi to this guy?" And I go, "Sure." And he picked up the phone, and I said, "Hello," and he goes, "Rick, is that you?" And I go, "Yeah." He said, "It's Lionel Richie. How you doing, man? You're doing great." I go, like, "Wow, this is huge." And 27-year-old kid from Williams Lake, and talking to Lionel Richie, and as it turned out, that song, by the time we got to Texas, was on the airwaves, and it followed us as a #1 hit all around the world, and it became a heck of an inspiration. And just a few weeks ago, I was down in Palm Springs for a fundraiser for the Eisenhower Hospital, and joining David on stage to just talk about the importance of healthcare. And Lionel Richie was performing there, and at the end, I had a chance to go and meet him and also thank him personally for that inspiration that he gave me all those years ago at a time when I was really struggling.
Yeah, that's a great story. Of all the countries and all the places that you went to during the course of the Man in Motion World Tour, was the highlight the Great Wall of China?
Yeah, there's no question that the personal, iconic, physical accomplishment was, just being on the Great Wall. It had so much meaning and symbolism, and
The symbolism.
and it was something where, just one thing I kind of wanted to experience out of the entire journey personally. And I have this photo taken at the highest point of the wall where we were on the journey, and it just reminds me there's no walls too big in life that can't be crossed, or climbed, and it's an inspiration to me even today, because we all have our ups and downs in life. So that was a great experience.
Rick Hansen is my guest. How long after the Man in Motion World Tour concluded did you found the Rick Hansen Foundation?
Yeah, well, when we started the tour, we had like the two big goals. One was to help try to create, an accessible and inclusive world, and the other was to find a cure for spinal cord injury. And that sort of the dual reality is that one day the next generation might not have to endure that pain and suffering post an injury that's considered to be impossible to cure, and then in the meantime, to help people not just with spinal cord injury but other disabilities live a full life and feel they don't need to be cured in order to be whole as a human being if barriers were removed. And so those are the sort of the small basic steps towards that on my tour. And when we came home, I had set this goal that I would really get back to my athletic career and kind of try to go to the Olympics in Korea in '88. And first couple of pushes on the rollers after I'd rested and wound things down, I quit. I couldn't finish my training, and I was wondering why was I having such trouble, and I realized that the entire tour had affected and changed me deeply, made me not just think of that those two dreams as a one-time contribution, but it became a lifelong ultra marathon of social change. And I retired from athletics, and I sort of kept my energy going. And because we had generated $26 million at the end of the Man of Motion tour and set up a
Mhm.
foundation, we needed to set a foundation up because the hill that we were really trying to climb was so huge, and we wanted to keep that momentum going and ultimately do what we could to tackle barriers that were desperately important.
Ted Woloshyn returns in a moment.
Have you been tasked with the role of a state executor or expected maybe in the future you will be? Well, if so, let me make your life a lot simpler by introducing you to my friend Debbie Stanley. Debbie is the founder of ETP Canada. They specialize in estate administration. Their goal simply is to help Canadian executors understand their role and how to deal with the loved one's estate. Let's face it, there's no school for this, but ETP Canada offers services such as executor support, estate accounting, and they have a new online course called Executor Ready. It's an engaging video designed to make estate administration easier and affordable. And those are two comforting thoughts during a stressful time. So call Debbie Stanley at 1 866 309 0387. That's 1 866 309 0387. Or you can get her at info at etpcanada.ca. That's info at etpcanada.ca. Do you have an upcoming wedding on your calendar? Hey, it's Ted Woloshyn for Tom's Place. If you're the father of the bride or a special guest who needs an elegant new suit or tuxedo, Tom will help you get ready for the spotlight. And if you're the lucky groom, Tom is a friend of the groom and the best man to help you dress the entire wedding party for your special day. Whether it's formal or informal, destination wedding, traditional or contemporary, tailored suits, or classic tuxedos with all the accessories, why rent a tux when it's so affordable to buy a classic that'll take you to events for years to come? Find out more at Tom's Place in Kensington Market. No one can dress you better or save you more than our wedding specialists. And don't forget, enter our wonderful wedding contest at toms-place.com to win a $500 credit for your wedding party outfits. Tom's Place will suit you.
Now back to Ted Woloshyn.
Attitudes has changed. The quality of medical treatment has changed over the years, and yet we still seem like we're a long way from where we should be. And on a personal note, I mean, I noticed this. My mother, in her latter years, was wheelchair bound, and I remember taking her to places and thinking, "My God, there's so many barriers here." And this is only like 5 6 years ago. And I'm thinking, like, why are these barriers still here? Like, how come? What's the deal? I can understand not being able to get into a restaurant that's in an old building because to redo you'd have to gut the whole place to put a washroom on the main level. and that I understand. But some of the newer construction that goes on is not even still being built with disabled people in mind.
Yeah, it's interesting. I've come to realize, in my young years, I thought, yeah, we could change the whole world and do it quickly, and had no idea really how big the task was, and also how complex it was. That disability has kind of gone through a bit of a series of stages in society where in the like decades ago, like even in the early days when I first was injured in '73, disability was considered almost like a charity, like there was not much you could do, so handouts and support and
Yeah.
pat on the head, a lot of stigma associated with it, coming from the old industrial age, and there truly wasn't a lot of opportunities back then, and accessibility was barely even a topic. Um, but then comes the veterans from World War II and other conflicts, and other champions advocating for that this isn't right. This it's a human right and value of a country or a society that people with disabling conditions should have equal opportunities to access and participate and contribute. And if those barriers were removed, that then that should be the representation of a just civil society. And so there was the Constitution that came in, for Canada as we set up our Charter of Rights and Freedoms, and disability was included there, and great words, and a whole new set of optimism. But you know, it took from the '80s, many decades, and even today, not every province. Just a few years ago, the federal government implemented legislation to match that charter, so that it wasn't just about human rights claims when there were injustices. By the way, 50% of human rights, cases in Canada are about disability, and that tells you something
Hmm.
about the state of our systemic approach. And so legislation is put in place, a lot of hope, still incomplete, still many provinces, not doing it or looking at it. And yet, even though we have legislation in a lot of places, it's still not the level of traction that you would expect to match the statement in our charter and our constitution about the kind of Canada we want. An accessible and inclusive society where people with disabilities are normally a part of, and not restricted by social, physical, or other barriers. And so, what that means is that I think we've constantly still struggled in that sense that this is not important enough. And and
Yeah.
and the other thing that's happening in there, Jed, is that I think disability is so fragmented by body type or disease orientation, or the continuum from the medical system into employment and into society in general. And because of that, I think people's attention goes to someone in their family, who's had, say, a stroke or Parkinson's or MS, or that's blind, or has is deaf, or has a hearing challenge. And so that big community, which is 22% of our population, and that aging boomer trend, which is growing
Yeah.
rapidly, is kind of fragmented. And and so I don't think we really see it as the big issue, and the big thing that has to be addressed yet. And we also have old symbols, like the one symbol you see for accessibility is the stick man in a wheelchair. Um,
Yeah.
and of course that doesn't represent accessibility for all. And so I think we have to start challenging ourselves. It's not just someone in a wheelchair. It's a whole range of people who still face the same barriers. And when they come together, and when society meets that, I think you're going to see acceleration for sure.
So I would think that because of this aging boomers society, as large as it is, that it will implement change whether politicians want to implement change or not.
100%. I think what's going to happen is, because we're now in that really tipping point, is that boomers are going to demand, that, hey, this should be just normal, and let's get these barriers out of the way. And I think businesses are going to also recognize, that this is it's not just a human rights or a charitable issue. It's an economic imperative. If you want, in a labor market challenge, if you want to increase your workforce or keep valuable employees, you best deal with the issue of disability and create a culture and recruit employees and make sure that you got the best talent. And especially with technology these days, people with disabilities can be some of the highest performing employees, and they're not limited by anything. And
Right.
and so if you start thinking also then of the products and services that can come from addressing disability, as my friend Rich Donovan would say, if you take a customer approach and you try to delight your customers, then you have to deal with disability. Otherwise, you're missing 20% of your market. And what kind of a
Yeah.
businessman wants or woman wants to be that naive?
Yeah, yeah, that's precisely. Let's talk a little bit about the accessibility certification program. What does that entail?
Well, you think about the barriers. There's so many barriers, and I guess one of the big keys to accelerating change is pick some barriers that the most people with disabilities can relate to bring our community together and also satisfy the needs of government and business and the social sector. And at the end of the day, the built environment, the places that we live, work, learn, and play, is obviously a focal point for where we should model inclusive societies. And so our foundation decided to tackle the built environment and really create a world class standard for being able to teach professionals in construction and the development community, architects, engineers, city planners, advocates, about a universal and inclusive design model and principle for the built environment, and then they could be trained and accredited in that discipline in schools
Hmm.
across universities across the country as a continuing education ticket. And then that knowledge could be applied to a rating system and an evaluation of either existing buildings or new buildings. And it would be rated in three levels: not accessible, accessible, which would be about the standard you would expect to match up your minimum legislative requirements, and then accessibility certified gold, which is thinking about how a building should function and making sure
Yeah,
it works for
yeah, yeah,
people. And then what we wanted to do is inspire everybody to have the same language, the same metrics, and then to celebrate the heck out of the gold space, because you know we want, what doesn't matter whether you're into compliance or whether you're into incentives, we want people to get to and beyond that minimum threshold line faster. And so we have now 1,700 buildings across the country that have been rated, many international starting to happen. We have 400 professionals that have been taking a course, and the goal is to expand that globally to over 100 countries, 250,000 professionals. And then all of a sudden, when somebody asks you, "Hey Ted, how accessible is Toronto?" Then because right now you can't answer that at all. You have no idea. It's a subjective thing. There's no metrics. But if you had these metrics in place, you'd be able to say, you know what,
yeah.
Toronto, is about 60% accessible, and we've got metrics because we have a rating scale. And then you can go back and say, and we've also got a 30-year inventory and infrastructure plan to be able to move from where we are to where we need to be. And we're going to turn off the tap on all brand new
Yeah.
buildings because everyone in the future will be gold.
It's funny that you say that because I was going to say if I had to rate Toronto on a scale of 1 to 10, I probably would think it was somewhere around a 6 because, stunningly enough, like I mean, there are still subways that you can't access
Yeah.
because it's stairs only.
Well, I remember I have my favorite shirt on here with, from the Para Am Games in 2015 in Toronto, and I remember there was a big effort to put the transit line out to the U of T Scarborough, where they were going to have the big aquatic and other games and facilities, and somebody in the transit program, as they were developing this thing, thought that it was okay to try to, in their minds, save some money by
Mhm.
actually skipping every so many stops, and they wouldn't be accessible, and so they just happened to skip the one at
Right.
Scarborough at the U of T, and so they
Oh,
had to
great.
go to the next one and to disembark, and then they had to invest millions of dollars in paratransit to take them back to the venue, and you just kind of think about that mentality, uh, you know,
Yeah.
and that's happening even today. Brand new buildings built because we follow minimum codes that are set up that were maybe good, but they have exemptions, and the scope doesn't include, the hearing or neurodiversity or people who are blind or have low vision, and so then you realize that there's all this energy that has to go into it to retrofit. There's conflict. There's human rights challenges, and why would we tax such important, precious resources and financial investment with poor design that we're going to have to reinvest exponential time and energy and tie up people on conflict and resolution as opposed to the next phase? It just doesn't make sense for whether you're into human rights or fiscal, sustainability, doesn't make any sense at all. So we're trying to move it to another level and normalize it.
So there's this old concern about how tough it is to teach an old dog new tricks. So as opposed to looking at the old dogs, let's look at the young
Yeah.
puppies. Is this where the Rick Hansen school program comes to be?
Yeah, one of the other big barriers that, are, if you talk to advocates, probably globally, worldwide, they would say that one of the things that the movement has overlooked is that next generation, that youth, and a lot of big social change movements, start when youth are educated, aware, and
Yeah.
then passionate about being barrier busters and champions for change, and so we've started a program here in Canada, to create a curriculum-based set of resources to allow teachers to be able to integrate their curriculum goals and teach kids about accessibility and inclusivity, and and then we have a group of ambassadors, people with lived experience that come in and they speak to schools and kids and show them not just about barriers but also hope and inspiration of potential, and and then lastly we recognize difference makers, and we really reward youth and teachers who are in motion making a difference, because we think that's inspiring and more people will get involved. And this program, we have global aspirations for it. We think it's important in any country, and when you look back, um, while I was starting in my mind anyway, back at this 27-year-old kid, a global movement. But little did I realize how big the world
Yeah.
was and how disconnected it was, and I felt like standing up in a stadium, trying to create the wave, and nobody's going, and now you look at the waves starting to happen, but it only happened with if you take the knowledge and the aspirations and even the solutions that people with disabilities and or their advocates have, and you take that out of their own purview of being the oracle of this knowledge, and you allow government and private sector and social sector to buy in and to take that solution and make it their own and implement, then you'll see true acceleration, and I think we won't be pushing a rope uphill in this next decade. That's for sure.
This may sound a little peculiar, and I hope it doesn't. But do you think that the pandemic may have had a positive influence on the way people look and react to those with disabilities? Because so many people were in lockdowns and couldn't do the things that they wanted to do, and suddenly they could draw a parallel to those people with disabilities who are also in lockdown at certain places and certain times.
Yeah, it did for sure. And if you notice you know the during the beginning of the pandemic, there were a lot of platitudes about being there for the elderly and for the disabled. But it took to the very end of the bucket of handouts to finally get past the blind spot inside government, that people with disabilities were the most impoverished, and they had so much like triple word score challenges that came at them because they, people with disability often are in that lower, income, bracket, or they're in the poverty bracket, and they require, attendance support and family and communities, and they were becoming isolated because of, of the restrictions. And even in the hospital, there was worry that if there was limited space for respirators, would they be put to the back of the queue because they were not
Yeah.
considered, in the way that they should be. And then lastly, they really struggled in terms of, being able to get out and to navigate, and they were at risk. So there was a lot of challenges, and finally, an aid package came in to support them, and yet I think it highlighted that, hey, hang on, at the poverty level was so bad with people with disabilities, we need to have a new a new income support program for people with disabilities, and it's now
Hmm.
just coming through legislation. I think that pandemic had that as, as an accelerator, open people's eyes. I also think that the pandemic has challenged people to realize that, remote working, and using technology is actually, productive for business in a lot of circumstances, and people with disabilities can benefit mostly from employment opportunities. And, try to follow a person. Let's say they're a high lesion quadriplegic and can't move their arms, and they're in an electric chair. you know that person has to get up at like 3:30 in the morning just to be able to get ready to get out the door, by 8. And then they have to worry about parallel transit and go 45 minutes to an hour, and then be there, and then they have to do the same thing coming back and the same thing getting down. It's like, whereas in a remote working opportunity, that person still has to get up early, but that transit's out of the way, and they can be completely liberated. And so I think it's going to have a powerful impact on employment for people with disabilities. And rising out of the pandemic came an emphasis on, diversity, equality and inclusion, and it's values based for women, for, indigenous, for, Black lives that matter, and obviously, people with disabilities. And I think that it's still a risk that it's being washed out over the bigger categories, because disability is fragmented. But if we keep reminding people, they go, of course, yes, of course, yeah. And so that's really having a powerful influence. And lastly, is in the economy of things, people are starting to actually, they're starting to vote and make financial decisions based on their values, and even
Yeah.
make investments based on their values. And why should we, for instance, on a building, why should we be just looking if I'm going to invest in that building if it meets environmental standards like LEEDs? But what if it doesn't meet people standards? And you'd still invest? I thought buildings were built for people.
Yeah. Exactly. Exactly. Well, I mean, there's no shortage of short term there's no shortage of stupid, I guess is what I'm trying to
Well, it's
say,
it's
without
opportunities
being rude.
opportunities for us all to become aware and to grow. For
Yeah. Let's talk about something a little bit different here, but something that you're very passionate about, which is conservation and fishing, which ironically is what indirectly led you to all that has transpired in your life, because you were coming from a fishing trip when your accident occurred. Um, Before I do that, though, is it true that during the Man in Motion tour, you had fishing gear in the back of the motorhome that followed you around?
yeah, yes, it is true. Yeah,
It is.
yeah, it
Okay,
is.
good. Because that's one of those things that you read online and you think, somebody's just made
Yeah,
that up. That sounds like a film or
yeah,
something, but it is
it
true.
is true.
So,
I can imagine being away for 2 years, 2 months, and 2 days, but to not be able to fish for for 2 years, 2 months, 2 days, I don't think so. I couldn't quite make it. So yeah, there were a couple times where we had to stop and express that passion during a break or something.
And you founded the Fraser River Sturgeon Conservation Society. Let's talk about that
Yeah.
because that's obviously a great passion of
It
yours.
is. Well, I think again, like you said, the fishing theme has been part of my life. I was able to build character with my family, my father, my grandfather, my uncles, and coming back from a fishing trip, changed my whole life with that accident, hitchhiking, and ultimately it was part of my rehabilitation, being able to accept help, to modify the way I got around, and to still be able to do the things I love, and and when I finished the tour, there's no question that fishing was also a great way to introduce people to the idea of disability or accessibility, like my
Yeah.
form of golf, and way better than rubber chicken dinners in my mind, and so I was able to bring people together and build relationships, and point the way towards how many barriers there still were, and bring champions in and raise big dollars, and ultimately when you're able to do that, then you want to think about paying it forward, because you can't just take from the environment. You have to also
Right.
contribute and watch your footprint, and so it was through that direct immersion that I was basically called to get involved in sturgeon conservation. But even that, didn't really happen without me sitting there for the arrival of our first daughter, looking through the window at the maternity ward, just gazing at my sleeping baby, and feeling so proud as a dad, and so much joy and love, and the guy beside me was looking at his first newborn son, and we were just chatting a little bit about parenting and hopes and dreams for them. And I said to the guy, I can't wait to get my daughter out fishing. And he goes, oh, you love fishing? I go, oh yeah. He says, so do I. And I'm have you ever gone sturgeon fishing? I said, yeah, I've fished sturgeon, many places on the banks of the Fraser River. And he said, well, come with me and I'll take you and introduce you to a guide who's not catching, but he's releasing these, incredible fish, and he's trying to promote conservation. And so I went and had a chance to have that experience. We caught a 6 foot sturgeon, and released this
Wow.
magnificent fish. And but the guide told me his story, and he told the sturgeon story along with it, because he was second generation connected to sturgeon, and it's linked to the early days when Simon Fraser was sustained by sturgeon meat from First Nations gift during the winter, and it became a
Hmm.
commercial fishery for the Queen and for Europe exports, and then it was clear cut and collapsed in 1910, and it hadn't recovered, and then not long after that there was a big die off of hundreds of brood stock, big 8 to 14 foot long sturgeon that just died and washed up on the beaches in 1993 and 94. And it was like it called to me, and I just said, you know what, I'm going to form a society, and the first thing we're going to do is we're going to find out what the population status is, because everybody had a different view. We brought scientists together, biologists, we brought commercial sport fishing and indigenous community, and we literally within 10 years were able to identify the status of the population, where the problems were, and now we're really activating solutions so that the fish will be able to survive into the future, because they've outlived the dinosaurs, survived 2 ice ages. But since we've showed
Yeah.
up, we've kind of they have also, not too unlike disability, they've been below the radar, not top of mind, and the consequential challenges from the actions of many other big systems. And now we can actually shine a light on what these fish represent, and understand that people will be able to join this movement, make good decisions about business, and have a great business, but also not have a negative impact on the fish or its ecosystem. And that's
Right.
really kind of cool to be sitting there looking at the maternity ward, looking at your beautiful daughter, and meeting someone who introduces you to a whole new world, and then a calling, and
Yeah.
then you can apply your passion and your talent, and bring people together to make a difference.
And do you take your daughter fishing?
Absolutely. And it's interesting, all three of them, and also one of my grandsons, he's 6 years old, and the youngest, who's 3. I can't wait to get him out. And it's because through that they get connected to their ecosystem and the environment, and they get out of the big city and the jungle, and they realize that we're all connected. And yeah, and I remember when I speak to guys like David Suzuki, and I chat to him and I say, "Hey David, you've just done so much to get people's awareness about the importance of the environment. So how can people who care about an inclusive society work together with people who care about a healthy and sustainable planet?" And and he said, "Well, they should." And I said, "Of course, but how?" And so the way I see it is, if everybody has a chance to, especially the 22% of people with disabilities, to get out into the environment, and they realize that it's accessible, they naturally become champions, because there's very few people who don't care about the planet that we live on. It'd be a bit foolish not to, and we can have great successful business, and there isn't this us and them. We just have smart solutions where people work together to find how to do it.
Healthy people, healthy planet.
That's right. Yeah, that's my vision, and everything I do, is about that on my life journey, and looking for that inspiration, the inspiration of Stan Strong, or someone like Fred Helmer, who was the fishing guide, or whatever it is on the journey. And then it's like, if it calls to you, why not put a little bit of energy into it, and do your part, to pay it forward.
As usual, it's been an honor and B, fascinating and C, inspirational chatting with you, Rick. I really thank you so much for what you've done, and for taking the time to chat with me again. It's been a long time since we have chatted, but you look pretty good for a guy who just turned 65.
Oh,
By
I've
the
got
way,
the filter on right now. Ted, thank you for being here all those years on this journey, and I'm super grateful. And I'm more excited now than I was, when I started on my Man in Motion tour, because life is a
Yeah.
wonderful journey, and we're privileged to be here.
Yeah. Well, let's talk again the next time you decide that there's something else that you want to add to this amazing resume of yours. And all the best to you.
Thanks, Ted. All the best.
Well, that'll do it for yet another episode. Thanks very much for tuning in. And by the way, our website is up and running. It's www.tedwoloshin, that's WOLOSHYN, one word, .ca. You can access any episode you want from the last year and a half. And we'll have all kinds of more stuff as we begin to enlarge that particular website. But it's up and running, so check it out, and pass on to all your friends, and even those people who aren't your friends. And in the meantime, have a great week.
The Ted Woloshyn podcast has been brought to you by Halenda's, the meat people. Enjoy their award-winning products at selected Metro, Sobeys, Fortinos, and Foodland locations. Halenda's, the way sausage should taste. And Tom's Place. For the finest in men's clothing at unbeatable prices, it's Tom's Place at 190 Baldwin in the heart of Kensington Market. Tom's Place will suit you. The Ted Woloshyn podcast is produced by Joey Roselli. Technical production by Paul Gatt. Music by Bike Thieves. I'm Becky Coles. Submit your questions and comments to ted@twmedia.ca.